The late 90s were a great time for PC gaming. 3D graphics cards were gaining traction in a big way, while developers were exploring new genres or simply pushing the limits of existing ones. But if there's any genre that embodies the spirit of the 90s, it has to be the 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter. Dropping players into a labyrinthian mass of tunnels, you are tasked with navigating complex spaces utilizing a full 6 degrees of freedom, while dealing with hordes of enemies, hunting for keys, and finding exits. You might know it by the name Descent, but the concept is shared with other games from this era, including Eidos Interactive's Terracide, an early 3D accelerated showpiece, and of course, Probe Entertainment's Forsaken. And thanks to the efforts of Night Dive Studios, Samuel Kaiser Villarreal, the developer behind the EX versions of Turok, Doom 64, and Power Slave, along with other talented coders, Forsaken lives on. Thus, in the wake of its re-emergence, we're going to look back at Forsaken both in its original form on PC and consoles, and in its new EX format. So let's get started.
When the Earth is left to die, and the galaxy's vilest progeny roam free, the future of our planet has become Forsaken.
The original Forsaken launched in 1998 for Microsoft Windows, the Sony PlayStation, and Nintendo 64. It was developed in the UK for PC and PlayStation by Probe Entertainment, while Iguana Entertainment UK handled the N64 version. If you were playing games at the time, you no doubt remember Probe. They were responsible for many ports to home consoles, including games like Mortal Kombat 2 and Primal Rage, in addition to developing original titles such as Extreme G. Iguana Entertainment UK, which started out as Optimus Software, would go on to develop games like Shadow Man under the Acclaim Studios T-Side name. Forsaken follows in the footsteps of the original Descent then. Players explore sprawling levels searching for switches, keys, and triggers while scrambling for the exit. Thanks to its more advanced graphics engine, the visuals are less abstract than Descent, making it easier to navigate the complex structures. The action features a Doom-like quality to it, with huge numbers of enemies swarming the player at any point. This mix of hectic action with fluid controls and puzzle solving feels great even today. It's a very fresh experience. It was also a showpiece for 3D accelerator cards at the time. With its fast 3D engine, Forsaken could fill the screen with colored dynamic lighting, a look so 90s it hurts, alongside some large detailed stages to explore, and of course lots of enemies. By today's standards, it's very basic, with entire maps featuring roughly 18,000 triangles in total, while enemy ships seemingly average around 200 polygons, with larger foes in the 800 polygon range. That seems pretty minuscule today, no doubt, but in 1998, it looked beautiful. Forsaken utilizes a portal system in map construction then. Basically, each area of the map is isolated into its own chunk. Since it does not support any form of view calling, the portal will need to be drawn to the GPU even when it's not in view. If we visualize this using Forsaken Remastered's console, it's possible to better understand how portals work. These yellow walls represent the boundaries between each portal. In wireframe mode, you can see how the level draws around you in real time. The maps are carefully designed to avoid performance spikes on the original target hardware, I would imagine. Thanks to this portal system, Forsaken maps essentially exist in 4D space. The Mindbender multiplayer map is a great example of this. From the outside, the tube appears to have two exits, with a transparent tube area in the middle. Fly inside, however, and you're suddenly within a very different space. These two areas exist in the same space, but clearly they are not the same. As a major PC release, Forsaken supports a wide range of 3D cards via Direct3D or software rendering, and was featured as a benchmark across many PC publications. It's a great test for determining the capabilities of your system. While 3DFX Voodoo cards could blast right through it at high frame rates, slower systems and cards tended to exhibit issues with things like alpha blending and slowdown. It was a great way to put your D3D performance to the test, and was used as a benchmark for quite some time. But it's not the only place you could play Forsaken. On the face of it, you wouldn't expect much from the PlayStation version. After all, the PC could offer high frame rates and gorgeous 3D accelerated visuals. It was basically a high-end PC title, right? So how could the PlayStation even hope to come close? Well, you might be surprised. Not only is this the full Forsaken experience that you get on the PC, it manages to run at 60 frames per second as well. You heard that right, Forsaken on PS1 is a 60 frames per second game. But before you get too excited, note that it's not a locked 60 FPS. In busy scenes like this, the game definitely drops frames. Zero surprise there, right? But still, it manages to hold it a lot more often than you might think, and the game winds up feeling extremely fluid. Beyond that, much of the game's visual identity is retained, with full-colored per-vertex lighting used throughout the game, along with many shared assets. Vehicle and stage complexity appears virtually identical to the PC version. Sure, affine texture warping is a problem here, as in other PS1 games, but it's still much more impressive than you might expect, and it looks fantastic in motion. Unfortunately, this version of Forsaken exhibits one serious problem: controls. As a 1998 game, the dual analog paradigm so common today had yet to be established. In fact, the DualShock had only been released late the previous year, so Probe had limited time to implement support for it. As a result, the configuration is difficult to handle today, to say the least, with strafing up, down, left, and right mapped to the right stick, while looking is mapped to the left stick. That may not sound like a problem on paper, but it's simply not tuned well enough, and the game is significantly more difficult to play compared to the PC version with its mouse and keyboard. Still, this is a fascinating release that compares favorably against the PC version at a time when PC hardware greatly exceeded the PlayStation in terms of hardware capabilities. Now, of course, this is still the case today when you compare high-end PCs against consoles, but really, the gap back in mid-1998 was significantly greater than what we have now. The PlayStation couldn't even come close to a 3DFX-powered PC. Then, of course, there's the Nintendo 64 version, and this is where things start to get more interesting. It recalls a very different time in game development when platform differences extended beyond visuals. Not only is Forsaken 64 the creation of a different team entirely, it's also a completely different game. On the surface, it looks remarkably similar to the 3D accelerated PC version. You have perspective-correct filtered textures, bright, colorful particle effects, and colored lighting galore. It looks fantastic. But once you dive into the game itself, it quickly becomes apparent that this is an entirely different beast. Let's compare. Stage 1 on PlayStation and PC is focused on navigating this stage. Your objective involves getting from the beginning to the end, while dealing with enemies and locked doors along the way. Eventually, you go through an escape tunnel full of lava and finish the stage. Later stages ramp up the difficulty in terms of puzzles, but stage 1 gives us the basic gist. Now, on Nintendo 64, players are instead dropped into a multiplayer map, with a counter indicating the number of enemies left in the map. You fly around this smallish environment, blasting enemies until you've taken out each one. Then, the stage ends. That's it. But of course, that's not the whole story either. There is more stage variety in Forsaken 64 than simply defeating every enemy, and the stages do ramp up in complexity over time. While it's never quite as puzzle heavy as the PC and PS1 versions, there are some brilliant stages in here, and Forsaken 64 does stand out on its own. In a weird way then, we basically have two different Forsaken games. Of course, being Nintendo 64, it should come as no surprise that the frame rate isn't exactly blazing. Unlike the PlayStation game, Forsaken 64 targets 30 FPS rather than 60, and it can still exhibit slowdown. It is smoother than your typical Nintendo 64 title, however, so it's difficult to complain. Another key difference between the N64 version and the PC PS1 version is the soundtrack. The PlayStation and PC versions feature a Red Book audio soundtrack played directly from the disc. Composed by The Swarm, it features a mix of drum and bass, which helped amp up the tempo of the action. The music was a big deal at the time, with Acclaim releasing the game's soundtrack on a CD and producing stuff like this.
I say you don't style long. Cause if you're rough, you're wild, you're wicked and you're dark. You know slip under the game, I say you don't style long. Forsaken crew.
On Nintendo 64, the music instead seems to rely on samples played back by the hardware, rather than streaming pre-recorded tracks. Some of the music is converted from the CD version of the game, and it works reasonably well. Here's the CD audio version. And here's the N64 version. Beyond that, there are some additional original tracks created just for the game on N64, which I must admit are pretty good in their own right. Of course, the N64 version does not feature all of the music from the CD audio version, mind you. Just some of the tracks have been converted. Either way, the dark soundscape of Forsaken plays a huge role in defining its atmosphere. Following the original release then, a sequel was planned. Someone going by the name Saber470 purchased a prototype disc and released a video of the game running, confirming its existence. It's a very early build indeed, but it does appear to vary greatly from the original game as well. He was then contacted by one of the people that had worked on this prototype, noting that Forsaken 2 was originally designed to be an Xbox and PC game, but after a roller coaster ride involving Shadow Man 2 and a cancelled port of Zombie Revenge for PlayStation 2, they started creating this game for PlayStation 2 instead. Needless to say, this never came to pass. Forsaken 2 was cancelled, and the series seemed to disappear. But it wasn't long before Forsaken would re-emerge. Some years later, the source code became available, and members of the community set out to build a modern version of Forsaken that could run on newer PCs. This goes by the name Project X, which just happens to be the code name originally assigned to the game during development back in the 90s. This version updates the engine powering Forsaken in many significant ways, including audio, video, and interface features. The only real downside of this version is that it does not include support for music playback at this time. At least, as far as I could tell. Still, it's easy to install and configure, and it has a lot of options to adjust. It's a great way to play Forsaken today. And for a while, this was the easiest way to play Forsaken on a modern PC. But now, another solution is available. This is Forsaken Remastered, a new conversion of Forsaken released by Night Dive Studios. Since its inception, Night Dive has focused on re-releasing and remastering classic PC games on modern hardware. And Forsaken is no exception. At its core, Forsaken Remastered is basically a deluxe special edition. Every map from PlayStation 1 and PC is included, but not just that, all the maps featured on Nintendo 64 are present as well. Of course, if you've been paying attention, you know that some of the maps in the N64 game didn't really fit in with the flow of the PC title. The solution? Some of the N64 maps have been combined and modified to create a singular whole, and one map even features a brand new section designed just for this version of the game. All told, you're looking at 32 maps here. Forsaken Remastered is available on PC then, as expected, but it's also on Xbox One. Keep in mind that it's been 20 years since Forsaken last graced a console, and it just so happens that the Xbox version is of very high quality. For starters, Forsaken Remastered offers full support for Xbox One X, outputting a native 4K. Now, it's true that it also supports a dynamic resolution, but it doesn't appear to engage often, if at all, making this effectively a native 4K title. That might seem like an obvious thing given its age, of course, but it's best to keep in mind that these classic games tend to place different demands on the hardware. This game is mostly single-threaded, for instance, which places extra demand on a single CPU core. The menu is also a fascinating thing for a console game. You can, for instance, toggle between different types of anti-aliasing, enable or disable ambient occlusion, enable motion blur, and more. There seems to be little to no impact on performance, however. Instead, these options simply offer users a way to customize their experience. On the PC side then, the options menu is even more feature-rich, with support for things like higher frame rates, ultra-wide monitors, and 3 different rendering APIs including OpenGL, D3D11, and Vulkan. This version of the game is also powered by Kaiser's Kex engine, version 3.6, though he is only one of several coders working on the project. Okay, so once in game, what can you expect? Firstly, controls are refined compared to the original release on both gamepads and when using a mouse and keyboard. The complete soundtrack is there, including both CD audio tracks and the original songs from the N64 version. Beyond that, the user interface is completely upgraded with improved font rendering and HUD positioning. You can even select between several different HUD options based on different versions of the game. My favorite new feature, however, has to be the map system. The original title could become confusing at times, and there was no map to catch your bearings. With the remastered version, however, a fully 3D rotatable map system in the vein of Metroid Prime has been implemented into the game, and it works brilliantly. And how about performance? While the game is predominantly locked to 60 frames per second, certain effects can cause the frame rate to basically slice in half. This room drops to the 30 FPS range, for instance, and the frame rate remains at this level as long as you stay within the specified portal area where this effect is rendered. Again though, 99% of the game runs at a rock-solid 60 frames per second on Xbox One X as well as the base system, just as you had hoped. Performance is suitably fast and smooth even in heavy battles. When combined with the smooth controls, it feels unbelievably fluid. Slowdown really is limited to that single effect which we saw around the generator. Thankfully, the developers are aware and working to correct the issue in an upcoming patch. While it may seem odd to encounter slowdown in a game like this, again, keep in mind the limitations of working with such an old game with newer hardware. Still, whether you play on Xbox One or the PC, this is the definitive version of Forsaken in every way. The additional content, feature-rich options menu, and perfectly tuned controls makes for a great time. If it's been a while since you've played a proper 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter, this is a great place to jump back in. Of course, this isn't the only 6 DOF shooter on the market this year. Key members that worked on Descent, for instance, have released Overload, which is basically a spiritual successor to the Descent series, and it's really good as well. Between this and various other mid to late 90s revivals, it does kind of feel as if we're entering a new age of nostalgia. For years it was all about 8-bit NES games and some 16-bit titles here and there, but lately we're seeing more and more late 90s 3D style games return both in remastered form or as completely new games. And with that, we've come to the end of another episode of DF Retro. I hope you enjoyed all 6 Degrees of Freedom while watching this video, whatever that means. Regardless, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing the YouTube bell, and following us over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.
Amidst the blasted remains of the forlorn Earth, the worst mercenaries this side of the sun do battle not only against each other, but also the robot sentinels that the government has left behind. Our future has become forsaken.